Inflation will continue to remain high, exacerbated by the war in Ukraine.
Inflation is everywhere.
As this will translate into higher prices that we have to pay for all our commodities, starting from food to fuel.
By the end of next year, we would be seeing a recession in the American economy.
Some of the costs that they're being asked to bear.
So it's a mother of all crises.
People have the right to withdraw their labour there.
For this same Lord I do repent. And heaven hath pleased it so to punish me with this and this with me, that I must be their scourge and minister. I will bestow him, and will answer well the death I gave him. So again, good night. I must be cruel only to be kind. As bad begins and worse remains behind. One word more, good lady.
Cruel to be kind, an oxymoron used by Shakespeare in his longest play, Hamlet. Perhaps this quote from the world's greatest dramatist has influenced the current global crisis. For what reason would we, the United States, donate nearly $7 billion of aid and pledged around $40 billion to Ukraine, knowing that the aid we are supplying is not sufficient for dealing and defeating the Russians? Russia's invasion of Ukraine is what happens when oppressors trample the rules that protect us all. It's what happens when big powers decide that their imperial appetites matter more than the rights of the peaceful neighbors. And it's a preview of a possible world of chaos and turmoil that none of us would want to live in. The U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said at the 19th International Institute for Strategic Studies Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. With that being said, then why be afraid, hesitant, or whatever you want to call it, with support on both sides of Congress, which is always a cause for concern, to send more and more aid to Ukraine? The people here in this country and the people of the global community are suffering horribly. Inflation around the world is skyrocketing, with many pointing the finger at the war in Eastern Europe. Are the people being left behind as prices for literally everything shoot out of reach, with phrases such as affordable housing becoming an oxymoron? How far can we, a global community, afford to allow a war without an end?
Inflation is everywhere. We are seeing it at the pumps, at the grocery store, just stressing out our budgets. But there's one population even more impacted: retirees. News 3 reporter Ellen Ice explains.
Our retirees should be one of our most sacred national treasures. Our parents and our grandparents shouldn't have to worry about how or if they will be able to support themselves. Times of inflation create vicissitudes, and because of that exact reason, we created the Social Security program in the 30s during the Great Depression. To forget about them, to toss them aside, is a huge disservice to the legacy they created. You and I are a part of that legacy.
When I have a certain amount of money to spend, I get a lot less. And I find that I'm passing up a lot of things I'd like to have because the prices have gone up so high, I just can't afford them all anymore.
Allman is disabled and living off Social Security and a small pension from his 40 years as a teacher.
And it actually gets worse each year because whenever we get a raise in our income on Social Security, then the prices go up.
The cost of living adjustment, COLA, for 2022 was a whopping 5.9%, meaning those who get a Social Security check every month saw the payment rise nearly 6%. But with inflation being so high, it was not enough and is expected to go up to around 8% next year.
Premium for our prescription drug plans, and now the rent's going to go up. So it's worse.
To Washington now, and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, who is expected to testify this week before the U.S. Senate Banking Committee as fears of an economic slowdown pick up. CBS's Christina Ruffini is at the White House with more. Christina, good evening.
Good evening, Nancy. This week, President Biden said a recession is not inevitable, something his
Joe Biden is living in a fantasy land. He's in complete denial of the possibility of a recession, yet he has the lowest approval rating of any president, lower than that of Jimmy Carter even.
Talking point for Biden administration officials on today's Sunday shows.
Not only is a recession not inevitable, but I think that a lot of people are underestimating those strengths and the resilience of the American economy.
But former Clinton Treasury Secretary Larry Summers said he doubts those economic strengths will be enough.
The dominant probability would be that by the end of next year, we would be seeing a recession in the American economy.
And I've said many times, tackling inflation is my #1 priority.
Inflation is his #1 priority, that is for sure. He's fixated on spending more and more money, and as we all know, government spending is what creates inflation, not the working class getting a raise so they can live in a world that they can afford.
Across the country.
This gas is killing me.
Prompting some members of Congress to call for a national gas tax holiday to offer consumers a bit of relief.
President Biden wants to do anything he possibly can to help consumers. Gas prices have risen a great deal, and it's clearly burdening households. So he stands ready to work with Congress, and that's an idea that's certainly worth considering.
And Christina is back with us now. Christina, 8 in 10 global CEOs now say they expect a recession sometime in the next year or so. So why are White House officials so insistent that a recession is not inevitable?
Nancy, part of this is the power of positive thought.
Positive thought, not rational thought. The idea that hoping your windows will get clean is not an effort to clean your windows.
To rising prices. Of course, a recession would compromise that economic bright spot.
Around 50 defense ministers from NATO and counterparts from around the world are meeting in Brussels to discuss military aid to Ukraine. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirmed that more weapons will be on their way.
And I'm especially pleased to be able to announce today that the United States will provide an additional $1 billion security assistance package for Ukraine.
The idea of fighting a fire with fire is a strategic one, but we're not using a strategic mind, we're using a positive one. Yes, the people of Ukraine need help with the war against Russia, but we're not supplying the jet fighters, bombers they would need to defeat them in this war of attrition. We're just stoking the flame, adding more and more money to the burn pit.
And U.S. Army General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, reiterated what was at stake in Putin's war on Ukraine.
The world has a significant stake in the outcome of what happens in Ukraine. The so-called rules-based international order is at stake that has been in place since the end of World War II to prevent great power war and to prevent large powers from conquering smaller countries with military force.
It's now time to bring you the part 2 of our interview segment on Business Nigeria. Now, as Nigeria's economic recovery continues to gain a little strength here and there on the back of services and agriculture, with gross domestic product growth reaching 3.6% on a year-on-year basis in the first quarter of this year. The International Monetary Fund...
Here we see the effects of the war in other countries around the world, in this case Nigeria, because they became dependent, like much of the rest of the world, on Russian exports. We live in a global community, and what affects one country now affects the world.
The report maintains that inflation will continue to remain high despite the ongoing economic recovery in the country. Nigeria's inflation rate reached 17.7% just last month, led by a renewed surge in food prices, exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, a development that has continued to see food prices soaring above the purchasing power of the masses.
Crisis talks at the Prime Minister's office in Colombo. A 10-member delegation from the International Monetary Fund is in Sri Lanka to discuss a bailout package.
It's the greatest crisis that we have ever had since independence. And the precursor to this is it's about 30% due to misfortune and 70% due to mismanagement. So it's a mother of all crises, and if not for the IMF, there's really no other safety net that can save us.
In Sri Lanka, they became heavily dependent on Russian oil. Because of this war, they now face a fuel crisis. Schools and other government buildings have had to shut down. These smaller economic countries don't have a fighting chance. They don't have the loud and thunderous voice of the United States.
Army personnel fired into the air on at least 2 other occasions. And in this incident, protesters turned on a VIP vehicle that had jumped the fuel queue. On Monday, police arrested 21 people demonstrating outside the finance ministry for obstruction. they said it had delayed senior officials attending meetings with the IMF delegation. If approved, the rescue package will be Sri Lanka's 17th bailout from the institution. The situation is dire. Schools have been closed for 2 weeks and public servants have been asked to work from home.
Wholesale price-based inflation, the WPI, rose to a record 15.88% in May from a year ago, its highest in the current series. Launched a decade ago on rising prices of food items and crude oil, government data showed on
India has a very similar current affairs climate to the United States right now. Current inflation threatens the status quo of the global community like never before. If we continue down this dark path, the future might become unrecognizable. Is that the future that positive thinking gets us?
Well, Chidakshi, a higher wholesale price inflation means that it will translate into higher retail prices for you and me. Let's go across to the wholesale inflation figures that have been announced today. Wholesale inflation has today hit a record high in the month of May, and wholesale inflation is at 15.88%, which is up from 15.08% that was recorded in the month of April. Now, this is a record high ever since the base rate was changed in the year 2012. Now, wholesale inflation has been in double digits for the past few months, and this is the 14th month when wholesale price index has been in the double digits. Wholesale inflation has risen for the third straight month. We remember even earlier in the month of April, wholesale inflation was above 15%, and for the second straight month, it has been above 15%, and it has been going up since the month of March. So ever since the war started in the month of February in Ukraine, wholesale inflation has been going up, and one of the reasons behind all inflation that we're seeing these days is fuel and power prices.
Protesting against the inaction they see in tackling the cost of living crisis.
In the UK, protests and strikes are happening as a result of the government not listening to their people. Cost of living continue to rise around the world while the leaders do little to nothing to stop it.
Last month's package of support announced from the Chancellor estimated £21 billion in this crowd at odds with stagnant wages for public sector workers.
I'm a nurse in the health service. Colleagues are leaving because they can't afford to work. Their bills are going up, they're having to pay for parking in hospitals again, and our pay is just not enough. We had a real feeling that after the pandemic things were going to get better, that we were going to be recognised, we were going to get paid properly, and it's just really taken the soul out of everyone that actually that's not going to happen, and we're going to get told yet again pay rises for others but not for public sector workers.
That discontent may linger. 3 24-hour nationwide train strikes start Tuesday and will disrupt travel, Network Rail says, for the entire week.
The strike for next week could be averted. The government are clearly trying to push them into this industrial action.
Keir Starmer today wouldn't support the rail strike. You said that you support the strike. Why do you think he can't say those words?
Well, I don't think it's about supporting strike action or not. I mean, people have the right to withdraw their labour. They have to go through a very, difficult balloting process. These are ordinary workers that have kept the country going, and I think it's time now for the government to stop grandstanding and trying to pitch the public against these workers that looked after us.
But the cost to bring wages in line with inflation, economists predict a figure north of £20 billion.
We have leaders telling us that inflation is caused by asking for a raise to be able to afford a reasonable living. We know that inflation is caused by government spending and not the working class.
He's hoping will stay blue.
I sympathise very much with everybody who's facing pressures caused by the cost of living. But what I would argue is that we will get through it, Tom. We will come through on the other side strongly. Don't forget we've got virtually record low unemployment, lowest for many, many years.
To brag about record low unemployment when those employed cannot afford the cost of living is just ludicrous.
Help not yet felt here, where today a major teachers' union threatened a mass walkout. Bidmen and bus drivers are already striking. Criminal barristers and postal workers are set to vote on action. Clashes feel palpable, but not yet inevitable.